Both these bills relate to the way we elect the president, national popular vote, electoral college, and so on. And just for a little bit of history, some of you were here at the time, some of you were not. This body before my time, voted down what's called the National Popular Vote Compact, the idea being that the state of Rhode Island would join a compact of states that would award its electoral college votes to the candidate that won the national popular vote. It was voted down before my time. It was voted down again my first year here in 2009, and then it passed by a vote of 41 to 31 on June 13, 2013. I'm looking around the committee. There's a mixture of people here who voted for and against that bill. My bill 5520 seeks to revisit this issue and remove Rhode Island from this compact. And I just want to address this because I think this issue gets a lot of attention, but I think there's a lot of misconceptions. It sounds good to say we should elect the president by national popular vote. And this movement got its impetus in the Bush versus Gore 2000 election when Bush did not win the popular vote but did win the electoral college, which at that time I believe was only the second time in U.S. history that had happened. The first time had been in the 1800s. So a movement began to say we should elect the president by popular vote. And the compact that exists, that Rhode Island is now a part of, would mandate that even if the popular vote of Rhode Island went for one candidate, if it went nationwide for another candidate, the electoral votes would go to that candidate. So for this year, for example, even though Kamala Harris won Rhode Island fairly easily, we would have been casting our electoral votes for Donald Trump, which I don't think would have represented the will of the majority of the people of Rhode Island. So it can lead to strange things like that. But the bigger issue is this. If we elect by the national popular vote, and we have to stop looking at this from a partisan political perspective, because that was the origin of this original compact. It was. And at the time, there was a movement, mainly among Democrats, to believe that if the national popular vote controlled, it might give them an edge in presidential elections. But we can't look at this method from that perspective. We have to look at it from an historical perspective and a structural perspective. And I'm just going to tick off a few things, and I'm going to turn it over to the witness. First, in 2016, for example, when it happened for the third time in American history, when Donald Trump won the Electoral College but lost the popular vote by roughly 3 million votes, if you removed two counties in California, LA and Marin County, Donald Trump would have won the national popular vote. I say that because it means that essentially you've got pockets of the country that have an overwhelming number of people that may not represent the interest of Rhode Island. The Electoral College was created to protect states like ours. If we were California, I might support this as a matter of not principle, but just partisan politics or influence for the state of California. But if you were a small state, the Electoral College magnifies your ability to select the president. And people will criticize that and say, well, Rhode Island always votes Democrats and no one pays attention to us. Well, maybe right in this current moment, but Rhode Island hasn't always voted Democrat. In fact, there was a whole stretch of years, many, many years ago, when Rhode Island always voted Republican. Things do change. We should be electing our president, and we should be setting our rules based on what's good structurally from an overall perspective, not from what the current political moment is. I also want to point out that if we had a situation where the national popular vote was ever razor thin, can you imagine the chaos nationwide when every vote was challenged in every precinct? It would be a disaster for this country, regardless of who the winner was. Look at Florida in 2000, what a mess that was, and that was at least confined to one state because it was the only state that was close, and in that year it happened to determine the winner. Can you imagine the absolute chaos? I'd be very concerned to see what would actually happen. I hope it never gets to that, but that's a problem. I also want to point out another argument that people make. They say, well, you know, the smaller states, some people believe the smaller states are Republican, population-wise, are Republican-leaning, and the bigger states are Democratic-leaning. That's not the case. This past election, I checked, of the 10 largest states, 6 of the 10 largest states by population in this last election voted Republican. 4, California, New York, Illinois, and Michigan, voted Democrat. And Michigan was razor thin, as we know. Point being is it's not like the larger states necessarily vote for Democrats. Likewise, on the smaller state side, it was split 5-5. Maine was one of the states that leaned Democrat. I know they split their electors, but overall they voted Democrat. So it's split, whether it's a small grouping small states together or large states together in the current moment, it splits both parties. That is not an argument in favor of staying in the National Vote Compact. And finally, I also want to point out, the biggest argument for this, I think, is philosophical for people. It says, oh, well, we should choose, the popular vote should count. I'm not saying there aren't, but if you look at our similar countries, they don't elect their chief executive by popular vote either. Canada doesn't, the United Kingdom doesn't, Germany doesn't. Just take 3 examples. They elect prime ministers. And most of the time, the prime minister would be from the party that gets the most number of votes because they get a parliamentary majority, but that's not necessarily the case. You can have a parliamentary majority, for example, in the United Kingdom, without having a majority of the votes of the populace, depending on how the votes break down. So there's no real pressing argument as to why the popular vote should control. And last but not least, I just want to point out this was voted down. I know bodies change, people come and go. This was voted down twice before it was voted through by what is defined in the way we vote in this place, a very narrow margin. I'm sure he'll love to hear this and remind us, but our current Secretary of State Amore was opposed to this. He voted against it. It was a bipartisan opposition to it. It was pushed through by the then Speaker. For whatever reasons, he supported it, and we know when the Speaker wants something, they can, they get people to vote for it. But at the end of the day, this is not good for Rhode Island. So one of my bills withdraws this from the compact, and the other bill, if we insist on staying, and I'll let the witness discuss it, because I discussed it with him and I put it in consultation, the other bill at least modifies the way we choose our electors.